Happy spring! Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I want to discuss kind of the overview of my spring knitting plans, the patterns I'm going to be making, and also my stash goals, because I do want to knit mostly from stash and kind of clear it up a little bit this season. So if that sounds interesting to you, please continue watching. We'll have a little chat. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to this channel. I would really love to see you here again. And also let me know in the comments, what are you planning to knit this spring? If you're one of my regular viewers, you probably noticed that I didn't do a standard what I'll be knitting in 2025 video. I just don't find it to be applicable to my knitting habits. I can't imagine myself sitting down in January and writing down the knits I want to go through during the year. It really fluctuates, and it depends a lot on, first of all, my budget and the yarns I can get my hands on things I'm inspired by, on some new releases I like, or new trends I want to follow or not want to follow. I find it easier for me to plan maybe a couple of projects in advance, maybe season by season, and have this freedom always to start something else or frog a project if I don't like it, or even starting a new project on a complete whim. I see something in Ravelry and I decide that I need to cast it on immediately, which doesn't happen that often, but I like to have that option, you know? And if we are talking about my 2025 knitting goals, the first one is to reduce my stash to about 5 kilograms or less by the end of the year. Right now I have about 9.5. The second goal, I know it will sound really silly, but I think probably some of you might relate. I want to knit bangers. I only want to knit 10 out of 10 projects. I don't have time for silly projects or really scrappy projects or something I'm not 100% sure and not 100% in love. I know it's not always possible. Sometimes projects just don't work out, but it's just what I'm striving towards, let's say. And I do knit all the time. I spend a lot of my free time knitting, and I spend not a big part of my budget, but a substantial part of my budget on yarn and knitting supplies. I don't want to spend this time and spend this resource on projects that I feel kind of meh about. I don't have the space for yarns I don't like. I don't have the space for projects I don't like. I physically don't have the space to store clothes that don't fit me or I don't feel comfortable wearing. So that's why I decided, first of all, to organize my stash like an adult and look at it realistically, knit from my stash as much as possible, and destash anything that doesn't serve me, let's say. A good example is my Lettlopi stash. I finished 2 Lopi sweaters, or one is technically a Lopi, and after those projects I had about 500 grams of Lopi left. Even though it seems like a lot, 500 grams seems like a sweater quantity, especially of Lopi, because it's actually really light and it goes a long way when you knit with it. It was in this really weird combination of colors, and if I wanted to knit another Lopi I would have to buy more Lopi. I decided that 2 Lopi sweaters is enough for me for now. I only have so many, hours in a day and cold seasons to wear Lopi in, so I just rounded it up and destashed it. I sold it and it's already bringing joy to its new owner, and I don't regret it in the slightest. If I want to make another project from Lopi, I can just buy more. I can order Lettlopi, even if it's the same colorway I destashed, it's fine. It doesn't have to take up space in my life just in case I would find this colorway useful in the future in I don't know, a year and a half. So I also destashed pretty much all of my sock yarn because I realized I don't really like knitting socks that much. I think it was because I knit socks for a commission and it was such a fiddly experience that I decided that even if I knit them for myself, it's not worth the effort for me. Maybe I'll change my mind in the future, but since I feel like I'm not planning to make a lot of socks, it's gonna be reasonable to assume that I don't need 400 grams of sock yarn. And this approach is also the reason why I decided to plan out my projects for spring, mostly because I wanted to work from stash. I'm not putting myself on a yarn ban. If I want to try something new or I have an idea that requires new yarn, I'm free to buy it. I just want to be more mindful when I do it. I'm not saying this is a definite list and I'm 100% gonna make all of the stuff I'm gonna talk about, but it's kind of what I'm aiming towards, and I'm probably gonna make more, and some of the things from this list are probably not gonna get made. It's fine, it's just life, but just for the fun of it, let's go through the projects. Okay, I'm back. I had to change my outfit because my camera was going crazy due to my white shirt. Yeah, anyway, let's start with the garments, I think. My first one is the project I'm actually the most excited about. I've been having such a blast knitting it. It's my Sirena Sweater. It's a pattern from Cookie the Knitter, and she has a couple more really nice cable designs. I think a similar one to the Sirena Sweater is the Semilla sweater. It also has a cardigan version, but I decided I want to make the Sirena Sweater. I kind of like the combination of cables more, and I already started my back panel. It's going by really fast, so I think I'm gonna tell you all about it on the podcast. I'm knitting it in this Yarna Opera yarn, which I bought specifically for this project, and I'm hauling it double. The closest dupe I could find was from Katia. It's Katia Cotton Merino. I think it's also a chain knit yarn. This pattern does knit up really quickly because it's designed for 5.5mm needles. I know that Ravelry says that it's a DK weight project, but it's really not. Like, you're holding two yarns double and not with like a silk mohair, but you're holding drops alpaca and merino cotton from Lana Gatto double, so it is quite chunky, but I'm always getting confused by those yarn weights, so if I mix them up in this video, I really apologize. I always classify yarns in my head by the needle size I need to knit them with, and it's really hard for me to keep track of all the fingering, bulky, chunky weights. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I don't think I will find much use for this project after like end of April, so I do want to finish it as soon as possible. It's my kind of top priority project. But the second sweater I'm really excited about is my Harriet Sweater, which is completely courtesy of my good friend Alona from Knitting Your Life. I was lucky enough to participate in the best kind of yarn swap. It was as follows. She gives me the yarn and I give her my thanks. So she has sent me this selection of colors. This is Loch Lomond from BC Garn, and this is Semilla Melange. This one is a little bit thinner than the Tweedy Loch Lomond yarn, but I still wanted to find a way to incorporate them into a colorwork project. The biggest quantity out of all of them is of this Semilla Melange yarn, so I wanted to use it as my main color and pair it with the navy yarn and leave this red yarn for something similar to like a Weasley sweater for next season, because I wanted to make one for ages and I was looking for the perfect tweed. And like, I think you agree that this is pretty much the perfect Weasley sweater type yarn. But then when I was scrolling through Ravelry to try and find projects for these two yarns, I stumbled upon a pattern I've never seen before. It's from Lynette and it's called the Harriet Sweater, and I realized I missed it because it's a really recent pattern. It came out maybe like 2 weeks ago. It doesn't even have any projects on Ravelry as of right now, which is crazy. It's super new. And the colorwork motif on this sweater really reminded me of Ukrainian cross stitch. And I just immediately got excited about the prospect of making a Vishvanka style sweater. This combo is going to be so beautiful and so reminiscent of the traditional Ukrainian clothing. I decided to scrap the idea of making a Weasley sweater down the line. My gauge is definitely smaller than the original pattern. The pattern asks for a Isager Tweed plus a strand of silk mohair, and I wanted to use this yarn on its own. I didn't want to go out and buy any more mohair for this project. So yeah, I had to size down from 4mm to 3.5, which essentially means that I'm knitting size 2 to get size 1. And this is one of those patterns in which even the smallest size has a ton of ease and it's super duper oversized. But I think the oversized nature of the sweater will add to the Vishvanka-ness of it in the end. So I'm really excited to finally be past the shoulder section and start the color work. And I was actually really surprised that this pattern uses 2 contrast colors. I thought it was just one. I'm really sorry. I don't want to be mean, but like, you really can't see the other color. It just has literally no contrast unless you like zoom in really closely. I don't know if I'm gonna be adding a second contrast color, but I do have my leftover stash of leftovers of my Garn from Lopi. It has a ton of different colors, so I think I might hold a double and use it as a second contrast color, but I'm not sure. And to be honest, I think anything that I won't be using in this pattern is gonna get destashed because It's been in my stash for like 3 years at this point, and I haven't done anything with it. I call it leftovers, but for it to be considered a leftover yarn, you need to first complete a project from it, but I didn't. I haven't made anything out of the Einband yarn, so I think it's time for it to bring joy to somebody else. The last sweater I'm knitting this spring should be actually my top priority, and I need to be working on it right now because it has a really solid deadline, but for some reason I just can't start it, probably because I'm having way too much fun with my Sirena sweater right now, but I need to do it as soon as possible. If you watched my podcast before, you know that I frogged my Moby sweater that was supposed to be a Christmas gift for my boyfriend, and we kind of moved the deadline to his birthday, which is at the end of April. I do want to use the yarn I bought for the Moby sweater, but I'm kind of torn between patterns because mostly I'm limited to sweaters that use 4mm needles, maybe like 375, 3.5, because that's the gauge this yarn has worked best in. This is Wool Time from Alizé, which is a sock yarn. Technically, it's like a DK weight sock yarn, and it's in a ball because this yarn was frogged. But regardless, I had a limited pattern pool, and I also didn't want to make a stockinette project because I felt like it's gonna be way too drapey and thin, and like if he wears it over a t-shirt or a shirt, it will kind of poke through, like the texture of the shirt will poke through, so I wanted it to have some texture. And my finalists, so to speak, are either the Waffle loop sweater, which is a pattern I knit in December, and I have the pattern purchased already, and I really like the texture and the shoulder construction of the sweater, so I thought of maybe knitting it again for my boyfriend, but without the cables at the front and back. But it's knit in 4.5mm needles, which means I have to size down to 4 and double check the gauge and all of that again. Or there's a pattern called the Heather sweater. I'm gonna try and do a waffle loop swatch on a smaller needle. I'll have to do some math, and if it doesn't work out, I will just buy the Heather sweater and finally cast it on, because I do need to finish it before his birthday. He truly deserves a knit sweater from me, so I really need to get a move on this project. Plus, it's gonna be about 1 kilo of yarn out of my stash when I'm done. I got up for literally 1 second and she already took my spot. Your purring is gonna be kind of distracting. Bye. There's one more cardigan I want to knit this spring, and technically it's not a cardigan, it's the Semplice Blouse, also from Cookie the Knitter. I want to split it in the middle to be a cardigan because I have this yarn, which is Lana Country Tweed Fine, and I've had it for a while now. I started a project from it a year ago, which was the Illa sweater, and I ended up frogging it just because I didn't like the style on me. Since then, I repurposed this yarn for a Maggie cardigan. It was a bit of a cursed project because I started to knit it when I was really sick. Once I was ready to split it for body and sleeves, I realized that my kind of shoulder section, the armhole, is like 10 centimeters long. I just didn't know where to go back to. It's been at that point so long since I worked on it that I decided to just frog it and start over. But since that was again one of those projects where I kind of tweaked the gauge and the row gauge specifically, I couldn't find my notes on that cardigan on the gauge I was working in, and I didn't want to kind of count it all again, so I frogged it and decided I'm not going to be doing the Maggie cardigan anymore. And I wanted to do the Puff Tee, which is a pattern I knit twice, and it's one of my favorite patterns. It's from Knitting for Olive. It's also one of my favorite garments I've ever knit. It's super versatile, and I get so much wear out of it that I'm always kind of in the back of my mind planning to make another one. And I thought maybe I would do the Puff Tee with a split in the middle to make it similar to the Maggie cardigan, which is like a cardigan t-shirt. But for the Puff Tee, I would not have been able to use this yarn. It's really similar in weight to the Semilla yarn. It's pretty thin and works best on like 3.5mm, but the Puff Tee asks for 4.5 and for 2 strands of silk mohair held together. So I scrapped the idea to make a Puff Tee from this yarn. I found the Semplice Blouse, and it's a lot simpler in terms of constructions compared to the Puff Tee. Puff Tee has this really interesting, technically raglan shoulder that kind of looks like a saddle. That kind of looks like a saddle shoulder, but this one is just a simple drop shoulder construction. It's also going to be easier to split it because, for example, the Puff Tee is started with the neckline ribbing, which you kind of fold, and then you start the raglan or like saddle shoulder increases. So it would mean that for a cardigan version, I would have to skip the ribbing instructions and go straight to the body and then pick up the ribbing later. But since this is a standard drop shoulder blouse where you knit the back, then you knit 2 panels at the front, join it all together and like go from there, you pick up for the neckline later, which would make it a lot easier for me to make a cardigan version out of it. And back when I unraveled the Maggie cardigan, I wanted to get a strand of either mohair or like alpaca mohair at my local yarn store to go with this yarn. I wanted to kind of fluffen it up a little bit, and I picked up this yarn, which is unknown mystery yarn. In theory, this is an alpaca yarn or like alpaca silk, but in practice, like touching it, I don't think it's burdened by natural fibers at all. I think it's mostly like acrylic or nylon, but it merges and like blends into this so well. You literally cannot tell that it's two different strands held together. Like, look at this. I made this swatch for the Semplice Blouse this morning, and I just really like how these two blend in together. The halo here is much more subdued than if I would have used the mohair, like in here, for example. So yeah, that's gonna be my last kind of big garment project of the spring, unless I come up with another project I want to make. Or no, I actually have one more t-shirt project, and it's gonna be my Palme Tee, which is gonna be my second Palme Tee. I knit my first one in summer of 2023, and I really enjoyed the pattern. It's from Lana, and it's knit in Sadness Garn Lana yarn. And my first one was this like light gray silvery color, and I really wanted to make another one in black or like dark gray yarn. I finally picked up some Lana, and to be honest, I thought this yarn would be darker in real life. It's kind of this charcoal graphite color, but I think it's still gonna work really nicely. And I want to make this one a little bit bigger because that one is kind of too small for me now. It's not too small, but like it's not as roomy as it was in 2023, you know. So I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be making this one in medium. I picked up more yarn than I need to, just to be on the safe side. I really recommend the Palme Tee pattern. It's actually really easy to knit because you're always engaged in these like lace increases and like the yoke opening up the more you knit it, and then it's just stuck in it, so it's super simple. She also has a couple of other lace motifs, so similar t-shirts with different lace motifs, for example the peacock tee, so check them out if you want. And Lana actually is one of my favorite yarns. It's really, really durable. I find that some linen yarns and some kind of cotton, like summery yarns, tend to get really pilled and really ragged the more you wear them. So this one didn't have that problem. It's super, as I said, durable. It wears really well. It drapes really well. It looks beautiful when you knit lace with it. So I just definitely recommend the Lana yarn. Not that it needs my approval. It's one of the most popular yarns out there, but this one really lives up to the hype. And this brings me to my next project, which is also going to be made in Sadness Garn Lana, but in this colorway. I want to use this yarn for a project that I wanted to remake for the longest time. I started to make these like net/market bags about a year after I learned how to knit. I made them for sale. I came up with the pattern myself, but I'm not claiming that I'm like the first person to get the idea for this kind of net bag and this stitch pattern, but I did have my method of making them. And the problem was that as soon as I decided that I want to release it as a pattern, I ran into a problem that the yarn I'm using it for and the yarn I stocked up on to make these bags for sale is really hard to find a substitute for. And it's also a Turkish yarn that is mostly available here in like Eastern Europe and not as popular somewhere in Western Europe or like the US especially. I'm going to show you the original bag so you know what I'm talking about. This is the bag. It's knit in this like net stitch pattern and has a reverse stockinette edging around it. I didn't know how to knit an I-cord when I came up with this, so I just used the reverse stockinette curling to get a similar effect to an I-cord, kind of like here. This yarn is quite chunky for a cotton yarn, so it's 80 meters per 50 grams. It's also much smoother than the other cotton yarns I've tried, and it doesn't have that issue of, again, being like ragged and pilled after a while, especially since this kind of bag does get through a lot of use and like a lot of wear and tear, let's say. So this time I'm really determined to finally write down the pattern for it and just get it off my chest, because I stopped knitting these bags and I'm afraid that I might forget how I made them, you know, I might forget the pattern. So I really have to, again, get it off my chest. So when I was ordering the yarn for my Palme Tee, I remembered that I wanted to try and knit this market bag in Lana. I think 2 balls should be enough for the bag, and if everything goes well, I'm gonna have my first tester call, which is really exciting, but also really scary. The last garment on my list is the Genie top. And it's yet another project where I will really have to play around with gauge, because this summer top, which I really like the shape of, and it has a really cute kind of keyhole opening at the neckline at the bust. It's knit in 4.5mm needles, which for me is honestly kind of crazy. I'm not gonna shade the designer or anything. I'm sure it's a wonderful design, which I'm planning to actually knit, but I find summer tops knit in more than like 4mm needles to be really impractical, sort of, because it's either too heavy or the fabric is way too kind of dense. I haven't really thought out my stance on this really serious issue, so maybe I'm just annoyed because I really like this design and really want to make it, but the yarn I'm planning to make it with is actually a leftover sock yarn. But in any case, the pattern looks really fun. I really like the kind of drawstring straps, and also I think I'm gonna skip the keyhole opening at the front and just do it at the back just to make it more wearable. And that's all I have in terms of garments. I also want to make a couple of shawls this season, and my itch to knit some shawls and scarves stems from the fact that I really enjoyed my experience knitting a Sophie scarf and found them to be really useful. I avoided that pattern for, well, a while because I didn't think I would find a place for such an accessory in my wardrobe. I thought it was really useless to be honest, but I was wrong. So unless I wanted to be stuck knitting Sophie scarves forever, I needed to look for more options, which I did, and I'm kind of rounding all of them up to make a video discussing any shawl, shawlettes, small bandana, scarf patterns that I liked. And I already made one of the scarves in the list, but I'm gonna talk about it more on the podcast. But the next one on my list is the Rikke scarf, which I'm going to be making from this Lana Gatto camel hair. It's one of the softest yarns to the touch. When you touch it, it feels almost whipped. It's super light and squishy. It has 40% camel wool and 60% merino, and I have 2 balls of this yarn. I really like this color, and it's kind of the reason I grabbed it in the store, but as soon as I grabbed it and touched it, I was just blown away by how soft it is. So I'm going to be using it for the Rikke scarf, and I think mine is going to be bigger just because I want to do this standard thing of increasing until I'm out of the first ball, then joining the second ball and starting the decreases. This pattern has this really fun and minimalistic eyelet details, and there's actually a similar pattern to it. It's called the Hayo or Hio bandana by Egyo Knit. I'm also happy to report that I finally found a shawl pattern to incorporate my hand-dyed advent yarns into. And these 4 colorways, this one is not on a skein anymore, so it's not as impressive, but these 4 colorways were, in my eyes, perfect for a gradient or fade effect on the triangular shawl. I spent quite a lot of time looking for a pattern. I think I'm gonna include it in the podcast I record once I introduce this project there, but for the purposes of this video, I just realized that the perfect pattern was under my nose all along, and it's shawl number 2 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. But I'm really happy I remembered that I have it because it's the perfect construction and like combination of motifs. I'm probably gonna extend it and switch out the motifs a little bit because I want the stockinette section, or like the stockinette with like little pearl bumps, to be reserved for the hand-dyed yarns, because I feel like the more texture you add to the hand-dyed section, the more kind of busy it looks. And to make these colors blend into one another more seamlessly, back in January when I was first kind of thinking about what to do with these yarns, I picked up some complementary mohair to go with it. These 2 are from Lana Gatto. It's their classic silk mohair, and this really pale peach color is actually a hand-dyed mohair on a nylon base. I couldn't find a suitable really pale peach color to go with these 2 yarns, and I didn't want to use the green because I felt like it would show through too much on the white sections, so that's the only one I could find that would match my vision. So this is the whole bundle I'm going to be using, and I'm really excited. If I'm being honest, I think it might be too warm for spring just because of this mohair and sock yarn combo, but it still counts as a spring project. You know, look at these colors. Of course, it's a spring knit. And another spring shawl I want to make is the Bloom shawl from Midori Hirose, and it's a really old pattern. It was a mystery knit-along, as far as I understand, back in 2014, so it's a classic, and I'm gonna be knitting it out of this leftover yarn. It's also not burdened by natural fibers. It's definitely an acrylic mohair blend. I got it for like €4 for this whole cone, which had like, I don't know, 200 grams in it. I have about 60 left. I'm aiming to use up all of it for the Bloom Bloom shawl. The pattern, like the lace pattern, is really easily extendable. You can just do more repeats to match your stash, so to speak. I think I'm also, if I'm not out of this pink yarn completely by the end of my shawl number 2, I would use it to sort of embroider the eyelets on top of the flowers. Also, a quick tip in case you don't know, if you have yarn on like a cardboard cone like this type of cone usually weighs 37 to 40 grams, so it's really useful. For example, if you're picking up yarn from like a thrift store and you don't know the exact weight, or you bought it at some point and you don't know how much you started with, how much you use, like it's just really useful and simple thing to know. The last thing I want to mention is that I will continue to use my leftover yarn to make December bows, and also I want to try and make some really small cute accessories for leftovers. For example, I found this pattern by Lana. It's called Poppy Rose, and it's this flower head accessory or keychain accessory that uses maybe like 8 grams of yarn at most. So it seems like a really cute way to use up these tiny leftovers. And there's also the Botanica flowers from Midori Hirose, which is just pure perfection. It's a perfect project for leftover mohair in different colors. And the more I stumble across this pattern, the more I think that I really want at some point to make a whole maybe like vest or I don't know, skirt, dress, whatever. I'll find a way. But I want to do a garment absolutely covered in those mohair flowers. So now I'm not so mad when I get mohair leftovers, because I know that one day. And in total, the projects I mentioned should use up about 3 kilograms of yarn, which sounds really hopeful. And if you want to see my progress on these projects, please subscribe so you don't miss my future podcast episodes. As always, let me know in the comments what you're working on and what are your plans for this spring. Maybe you're knitting the same patterns as I am, so let me know. Also, it feels embarrassing to even bring it up, but a couple of people asked me if I can set up a coffee page because they really wanted to support the channel, which I appreciate enormously. It's super generous of them, but unfortunately I'm not able to use coffee. They don't work with Ukrainian creators, as they say, because of the current situation, which has been current for 3 years now. But anyway, it has to do with the PayPal's terms of service. They don't allow commercial transactions in Ukraine, whatever. If I find an alternative that does work with Ukraine, I will of course link it in the description, but it's absolutely not obligatory. You don't have to do anything. The fact that you watched this video until the end is support enough. So thank you so much for being here. I wish you a lovely day and a wonderful spring ahead. Bye.